So, if I'm not mistaken, this is working, and the question becomes, did anybody show up when I didn't do the premiere for the live stream? Because the last couple of times I did, I had a whole bunch of people showing up, and that's because it said I was going to do it hours in advance. This is not me doing that. So pretty much what I'm going to do is take questions as before. And let me see now. And I can make this go off somewhere because I've got my little popped out window, and this is what people can see. Oh, it has announced on Twitter and places like that. That's cool. That is fine. So yeah, good morning. I've got my paper and Sharpie. I don't know whether I'm going to be having any wonderful brand new ideas today, because there's no predicting that. I'm a little frustrated because, hey, I got a couple of peoples. This morning, oh God, lots of things. Okay, never mind. I was going to explain how I was doing work on the axolotl, and that's not working properly. Or rather, it's working properly, but I flashed it to firmware and then forgot to set the patch or save the patch. So basically, I did that and then have nothing to show for it other than what's live up there. But instead of fussing over that, Bernard, the reason it's difficult for me to announce when plugins, it depends what you mean by when plugins are updated. Like if you're talking something old that's never existed as VST before, that comes out as an actual product release. When we're talking about stuff that has come out and then I've had to update things sort of on the fly, that's typically in whatever thread people are making the complaints about. So that might be in Gearsluts, might be in KVR. Yeah, I mean, it depends upon the concept of what update means. So Gamma, cool. I'm glad that acceleration is working out for you. And yes, everybody can ask questions. Bayan, I'm assuming that's how you pronounce Bayan. Modeling EQ. Well, the thing about analog EQ is it's typically implemented by IIR filters rather than FIR filters. So if we're talking about doing analog EQ, there's ways to do that and ways not to do that. If you do a digital filter that is phase linear, then, oh, Casraval went from ooh to no. Oh dear. How about yes? How about like that? There you go. So I take it your second thing said is the only thing that the EQ. So I'm trying to follow your language there. Analog is far from just a digitally modeled EQ curve, because that can be implemented in a number of different ways. working on being able to add bilinear filters to my little bag of tricks, because I think I can do those better than they're currently being done, or get more elaborate and do like trilinear filters and things. Then past the how can we model analog EQ, splitting the plugins into categories. And it's difficult for me to compare the changes inside new updates zip with your categorized ones. In some cases, like with audio units, you can't actually rearrange plugins into folders because they have to be all loose in the plugins folder. I guess what I don't understand is how plugins being updated has anything to do with new updates.zip, because they always get included in new updates.zip. Gamma, the reason I'm not doing synths is because I haven't made one that worked yet. I have fooled around with like the audio unit synth kind of thing. I didn't really get anywhere. And it is possible to do, certainly, but one of the things that is holding me back with some of that stuff is both that both with synths and with graphical user interface plugins, in order to add that, I need to be able to do it in audio unit and VST simultaneously now. I'm not comfortable doing something just for Mac at this point. It seems as if that would be kind of ungrateful to the people who have sort of jumped on the bandwagon now that I'm making VSTs and such for PC. So I'm not entirely prepared to do that. Go back to Creator Studio. I mean, that's not a good reason. It is a reason, but it's not a great reason. It's just another one of those things where, like, well, I haven't learned how to do that bit yet. So it's kind of like with Linux. Like, once I did Linux, everything was Linux. And I've talked about doing VCV Rack, and haven't started doing that yet. And once I do that, I'll have a bunch of work in store because lots of things are going to be VCV Rack. But it's slowed down a little bit by the fact that I don't think my computer will run VCV Rack very well because it's probably not quite powerful enough to do it. Hopefully in future I will be able to have one that can run VCV Rack better, and then it'll be a lot more interesting diving into that. I can go over some of that stuff for you now. Technically, we're making a video now, so specifically, what are you interested in looking into? Because that is doable. I can think I don't see why I shouldn't just go and answer whichever question you've got at the moment, because this is Monday, this is going over stuff for you. I've got a compressor list. Do you want me to start going over some of those things? And yeah, okay. I'll go to compressor. And don't mind me, I'm still kind of fluey, so if I choke out for a moment or stop talking, it's because it's like, oh, there's a piece of lung that's trying to come out or something. It's not great, but gradually it will get better. So let me go from the bottom of the whole compressor list. I've scrolled right down to the bottom here, and this is actually, I might as well go to the VST era. Excuse me. Hmm. Well, the thing about is you got to understand all of these are different. So the idea is that maybe if you're not reacting to the sound of a thing, it's because it's not right for you. People will latch onto the funniest things. So as far as the differences, and I've got compressors right here. Pressure 4 is the first in the VST era. I'm looking at the video for that, and I'm tucked away in the bottom corner of the screen, and I have an incredibly long beard for this one. I don't know exactly what I was thinking. People scolded me until I was a little bit more neatly trimmed. Pressure is the one where it's got a very simple algorithm that I've done a lot with, and it can be manipulated into different forms. It has a sort of Fairchild-y squished effect because it's very... there's a control on Pressure 4 that has mewiness, and that means you can get a very mew-style behavior out of it. The one after that is Thunder. Thunder is designed for sub-lows, and it's a kind of special purpose one. It's rather than eating up low frequencies or being strictly a I'm not sure how well this is going to work. So Thunder is the low frequency one. Let me just burn through them. Pyewacket is the one where it retains the onset of the attack without removing it, basically. And it does that because it goes from neutral to a negative density setting like you'd have in the density plugin. And it does that rather than just attenuating. Point is a transient designer that does, and I'm looking positively Rasputin in the Point video. Point is one where it can radically reshape the attack or decay and is a little unmanageable. Like you can make the attack explode quite violently or get suppressed. Surge Tide, hey Mark, thanks. Surge Tide is about taking multiple levels of compression, like, and I will make a picture for this one. So what Surge Tide does, like, you can have a frequency of some kind. Now, if you go above a threshold, then you might tell the waveform to do a thing. You might tell the waveform just only standard this limit, in which case it's clipping. Or you might tell the waveform, if you're going in this direction, keep going, which would be the opposite of clipping. If you have the waveform curving, and you tell the waveform to keep curving the way that it is, that's yet another behavior. And if you have the waveform curving faster and faster, it can't actually do this, but that's what it would do if it was just a line. Well, I guess it's something to talk about anyway. Otherwise, I'll just sit here going, cough. So what Surge Tide does, and Surge is kind of similar in its way, is it only changes the rate of change of the rate of change of the waveform. So if you've got the waveform going in a certain way, then its rate of change is like plus this for every sample. If it's changing like this, then the rate of change is getting increasingly down here for every sample. And if that increases in speed as well, what you get is it's a thing where I have to have a better picture because this is the worst picture ever. It makes literally no sense. Oh dear. Let me see what I can do here. Sometimes you're just going to get Chris that needs more coffee or isn't making a lot of sense. If I'm lucky, I'll get plug-in ideas out of it, but with this, it's kind of sketchy. So another waveform of sorts. If you needed to make this go down so that you like stayed below this line, once it went over the line, I've got a coffee. I'm not sure how much it'll help. We'll see. This is the last day of the year. Usually my last day of the year is fairly sketchy. And once I wake up tomorrow and January 1st, I'm like, okay, holidays are over. Now I can just start having regular days again. But if you were, it's the worst picture ever. All right, it has a smiley face. Now it's the happiest worst picture ever. Okay. If you had your waveform going up past this threshold point and you didn't do anything about it, then it would just go past the threshold point. So a compressor means you're doing something like scaling the whole waveform up or down. In compression, you're going to be scaling it down. It'll squish it, it'll compress it. Versus if you expanded it, you'd scale it up. And you could simply calculate it at any given moment, like this top point, and say at any point you just make the scaling of it be smaller. What that will do is cause the if you did that, what would happen is this. You would have the waveform go up to this point. It would hit that and then just start flat topping the wave because it's already at that. This is like 0 attack speed until it starts going back down, and we have no release speed on this. So once it's reached a turn down point, and the metric for that would be 0 and 1 amount of turned down. As it hits this point, it starts ramping up the degree to which it's turning down the signal till it gets to that top place. And then from that point onwards, it doesn't have to do any further because it's already stopped clipping. So from this point afterwards, the scaled down version of this waveform is, and I've misdrawn this bit because it will just cross in the same place that it did before. It'll just stay clear of this turn down point, and as long as you haven't exceeded it again, you will get no flat top part of the wave. This is the part of the wave where it flat tops because it's progressively just hitting that point where it's turning down the volume to stay within the amount. You'll also notice that that has caused it to not be the smooth sine wave shape anymore. And that's something that you can have happen with compressors that have a really fast attack speed, is they can distort the front of a waveform as they are adjusting the speed of the clip. And then if you had, say, something like this, and our turn down point was here, let's say again that we have the thing where it's going to try to go to a scaled down place that you can see that once it's turned itself down, it goes to this point where no further parts are distorting. Yeah, I mean, keep chattering away. It'll give me more things to talk about. But if you have a slow attack speed, let's just say an attack speed slow enough that it only fully takes effect by here, it will start to overshoot because it doesn't immediately react, so you'll get an overshoot rather than just keeping it within the amount. It takes time for it to start turning itself down, so it'll have this effect, and once it's beyond the point where that threshold, that's what a threshold does, is taking effect, and assuming you don't have a release speed, then it'll stay the same. On the other hand, if you have a release speed where you're able to put in gain afterwards, you start getting this out of it, because it'll start turning up the things at the end of the wave. The stuff that's too loud gets turned down, and then it starts cranking back up again. And that's what you get when you have a okay, Gamma has had an observation. When the plugins have, like, I'll use pressure as an example here. Pressure does this. Pressure has a attack speed. It's just it comes out of how it works. Like, I'm pretty sure pressure attacks faster the farther beyond this you go. So if you went way past, you would start getting a reshaping of the wave kind of like this. And that's why it's sometimes difficult for me to define stuff like that, because it gets complicated. For instance, if we've got these threshold controls, and some compressors will only have a threshold on positive, more will have threshold on both positive and negative. And if you have the compressor cranked way up, what you'll get is this characteristic look. Where the attack speed is kicking in and it's cranked up so much everything becomes overwhelmingly loud, and all the little tops of the wave end up hitting the threshold and getting whatever behavior is being put on it by the turning down effect. This is why compressors differ from limiters, and why some of my cleanest compressors also allow for overs and aren't very good at being limiters, because the more aggressively you catch these overs and force them to be within the range of the threshold, the more it'll distort the top of the wave. And the slower it reacts to these things, the less it will distort the top of the wave, but the farther you can go beyond the threshold before the turning down kicks in and has its effect. So when the plugins have no specific attack, release, etc., and only say a density control, and that would probably be more along the lines of pressure or whatever. I mean, I do have a specific density plugin. That's not a compressor. That is just a saturation effect. I can show what that does like this. Waveform. Supposing you have it so that you've got density and you've set it so that the density threshold is like this. So you're going to distort everything, and you're going to distort it so that it fits within this area. What density does is it goes from maximum distortion to minimum distortion in a wave shape that's kind of like a sine wave. So rather than doing a hard clip, and I can draw in a hard clip like this. Boop. Hard clipping makes the waveform look like that. What a soft clipper like density does is the parts near zero will continue to be the same. Like they'll have the same basic wave shape. We're not going to distort this part at all. If you were simply compressing it, you would have to rescale the whole wave and it'll cross zero looking more like an angle like this. That's what compression will do because it's dynamically changing the whole gain of everything. What density will do is keep this angle like this, but then smoothly go between the angle at zero, which is very close to the original, and soft clipping at the maximum amount. So it'll kind of smooth off the tops of the waveform in that way. And you'll also find that smaller stuff with soft clipping will also get turned down as well, because it's not simply hitting it at a hard distort point. It's going to affect stuff in the middle here. Since you mentioned density, I thought I would draw some more terrible pictures, and that could be the picture of soft clipping versus hard clipping. Now, pretty much for all of these, you do have to listen to the effect. I mean, that's kind of what they're for. The whole idea is it's altering the sound, so there's not a lot useful to be done as far as doing it through, well, the whole overtones thing is a whole other question. Like, let's quickly draw another dreadful picture. But yay, all the terrible pictures. Here's a terrible picture. Pretend this is a sine wave, though it's totally not. If you hard clip that, and this is your waveform on a spectrum analyzer. If you had a sine wave, the sine wave shows up in the spectrum analyzer as just a single point. And we'll draw another one here. Happy little sine waves. I'm Bob Ross. Here is the sine wave in another place, and the difference between overtones works like this. If you have these sharp corners on the waveform, those are producing a series of overtones. That look kind of like that. The sharpness of the corner determines how far out this chain of overtones goes. Whereas if you rounded them off slightly, and I'm drawing just a very slight rounding off, you would have some of these overtones missing because the sharpness of the edge determines the frequency at which the waveform is making a turn or doing something. Again, if you had a waveform and it just makes a sudden corner like this, that's going to have high frequencies over here. Or if you had a waveform and then there's just a single spike like this, rather than being a single line, that's kind of like a series of frequencies going right up to the highest frequencies. This is what you'd call a Dirac impulse. It's a single dot in the samples that is different from what the other ones were, and cymbal sounds and hi-hat sounds can also sometimes generate these. And there are high-frequency sounds up there. They don't have a lot of low-frequency content because low frequencies are like the area under this wave. And if you don't have an area under the wave, you're less likely to have content over in the low-frequency side of things. And then, if you're doing a super soft clipping, where this is you with an incredibly soft clip, and it's doing the minimally, yup, bingo, good job, exactly. So the curvature at the threshold determines how many of the Fourier coefficients come out. If you have the ultimate soft clip, what you get is just one overtone, and that happens in density, and that happens in spiral, is you are working with the reshaping of the wave that is making the corner being generated as smooth as possible. As a result of that, the FFT stuff, the frequency analyzer stuff, you're not going to get the chain of overtones like this. Instead, you're going to get just the single overtone. If you push into that even harder, you start to getting another one, and so on. They start coming in sequentially. And the farther you go, the more of them you get until you are pushing it so hard that you're starting to get that square wave look. And then once you finish doing that, if you're not oversampling, it reflects back off of the Nyquist frequency, and you start getting aliasing. And that is how you get or avoid getting aliasing. And an interesting point to that is if you're doing stuff that forces the samples to be arranged in a way where they are a super sharp corner, they'll start producing aliasing almost immediately. Like the square wave thing that I drew, technically, that wouldn't just only go out there. It'll start producing another set that go down here. This is what I was doing when I got into that Unbox plugin. And bingo, Gamma is on fire. You're coming up with all the, what do we even need me here for? I just listen to everything Gamma says, and it's all brilliant. Here's the deal. I showed you, this is actually becoming useful, I suppose, for people who need to know how compressors and things work and why digital produces problems in some cases. Here's me with my zero and my clipping points and stuff. Or actually, that can just be the full range. And this can be our threshold. So, waveform. If we are trying to produce compression and turn things down so that it doesn't go past this point, and I'll draw it as such, let's just say that since this is supposed to be a round top here, the point where it stops turning down is here, and you have a infinitely fast clip where it'll just automatically go to whatever the threshold you need. Here's our compressed signal. Notice something interesting? When we start going up and hit this point where we're reacting with infinite speed, that just made a totally infinitely sharp corner. It just, once it hits that point, it just plain stops. Since it hit that ultimately fast, ultimately sharp corner, that means that point is generating harmonics, and we already know what those look like because those are exactly the sequence of That's a terrible drawing. Name with the terrible drawings. That's fine. Whatever. I'll extend the box a little bit. So the sharpness of this corner means we've got this series of harmonics again. And because it's so sharp, it's aliasing. So taking a compressor and making it have infinite speed as you hit a threshold so that it's just a straight up hard clip causes that moment to produce harmonics that are so high that they alias and come back into the waveform again at whatever frequency. It'll just sort of keep overlapping. You know, the way that it behaves is kind of like if you take a sine sweep and then run that into distortions, and then you start hearing the overtones bouncing back and going down again. You can literally hear aliasing when you do that. The reason that people don't demonstrate stuff is because almost nobody's plugins will sound anywhere near good if you do that to them, because it's a torture test. Which brings a idea, so there we go. As usual, when we're actually digging into these things, it does give me ideas that perhaps sometimes will help and go somewhere. Namely, I have something that works on this stuff, but I've not applied it to compressors yet. Here's something that happens. If you've got a D-clip, and you're doing a waveform, and one of your sample points is like here, we'll draw them as dots this time. Suppose we have these sample points. Yeah, I showed that in the inbox video, and people were shocked. They were like, is that really a test? I'm like, yeah, it's really... It got confirmed, like, yes, this is really a test. People don't do that because it makes plugins, digital plugins, sound really bad. And I think that's valuable to do, is make digital plugins sound really bad, because how else are we supposed to fix them? So here's the deal. If we are going to do AD clip does this. It wants to keep stuff within this, so all of these points are going to get moved down to the dotted line. That's what AD clip does. But, and this is also true for one corner clip, and that's a good point also, I think, with regard to what I'm talking about. What AD clip does, no, they won't. No, they won't want to, because they'd have to fix the problems that are revealed by doing that, so we wouldn't want to go there. What AD clip does is takes these succession of samples, and rather than pin the next one past clipping to the top amount, it will go, here's the top amount, here's the last one, let's do a proportion of the last one and put the sample there. And I can say, for instance, we'll call it half the amount. And one corner clip is doing exactly the same thing, but even more mellowly. Let's assume that we want to have the difference with one corner clip. What will happen is this. This sample needs to approach this point from here, so it will go to half that point. This sample needs to get to here. It will go to half that point. This sample, when you get to there, so it'll go to half that point. I'll show you in a moment what I got. Just here's what you get. This is what one corner clip does with a clip. Rather than try to go up to here. And remember, it actually goes around those points rather than straight one to another. But the smooth version will actually go closer to straight one to another. What one corner clip does is it'll have the difference each time. If it knows it's beyond this clipping point, then it'll ignore the clipping point and it'll start going to a percentage of where the last one was and the clipping point. So basically, it will start approaching that point at the speed of whatever proportion is being done. In this case, this is roughly half. It defaults to around 0.6 or so. And AD clip does something where it's only comparing the one previous one. So what it would do is, it comes closer. So it would go from this point where it has to make a departure AD clip will follow this top line where it'll get closer. But it'll take another sample to get to the point where it's hard clipping. That's what the AD clip algorithm does. And it also does a different thing, which is it's also tracking the departure sample so that if the previous one if it's going to come back into the desirable range again, and the previous one was still clipped, it'll take the one that had been clipped and bring it back down a little bit, which is basically, rather than doing a hard clip, it'll take a single sample. Let's see. Let's say we've got these for samples. AD clip will pick a single sample and on the onset and the exit, it'll put in an entry and departure sample. It's possible, but when we're doing, the thing about one corner clip is that it's doing it in succession. So it's essentially like an IIR filter for that kind of stuff. It considers all the samples. It'll approach the clip point with increasing speed the faster it goes. But it's always converging on it rather than actually hitting it. And how fast it adapts determines the tone of what it's doing. And AD clip is, because the thing about one corner clip is that it'll just leave the clip zone immediately if you want it to. Whereas AD clip uses a single, it has a sample of latency and a sample or two of latency, something like that. And the onset sample into clipping and the exit sample from clipping get pulled down a bit, determined by how I've coded it and the numbers and figures I've put in. Because it could be anything. It could be like onset sample is like literally no change. Exit sample is literally no change, at which point it would do a really weird, crazy distortion. Bip. And alter the sound in a weird, awful way. Thinning out all of these. So here's what I was getting at. If we've got this AD clip behavior where we got a distortion and we've got a single sample and it's going to be scaled back from the successive samples. Supposing you were doing compression, because here's where we get with the issue with compression. Notice how when the compression goes beyond a certain point and it's either going to overshoot or it is going to put a sharp corner on the front edge of the wave that way. Well, with AD clip, I am avoiding that behavior by having a calculated different onset. So the question becomes, could I have the threshold dynamically vary by the factor between the previous one and the degree of clipping? I need a new piece of paper for the next bit, because this could end up altering my compressors and do so in a way where they will react to high frequencies differently. So let's draw a middle part there. And there's our threshold. I'm going to draw some sample dots again. So the idea is, if we have a compression threshold, and you know, something like this, you can always use them in reverse. It's kind of like when I did dither timbers and raw timbers, and then did raw glitters, which is the same thing only in reverse, and it had a strikingly different behavior. So if I can do something where it's affecting the crossing of the threshold and redefining the threshold based on how fast it's going past it. See, the other question there is, do I need to do that in such a way? Because it seems as if this might be a way of making a edge softened limiter with extremely fast attack speed, and that might be useful too, because I don't know if anybody's doing a limiter in this way. So output sample, the maximum output sample would become these. Then if we're doing the this factor, we're causing the desirable output to become this. That's lowering the position that it's at. So the threshold becomes lower because we're able to look at it and go, just for this instant, this threshold is going to become here. And then as a result, let's see. The threshold goes down for just a moment. If the threshold is down here, then we're forcing the amplitude to get attenuated. So this guy goes down to this point, and this guy goes down to something like here. Let's suppose it was there. It might go down to the point where it's no longer exceeding the threshold, the real threshold. That, or we can continue to use the altering threshold as long as it's not beyond this point, which is the real threshold. It's a threshold of the threshold. The complications of all this. And that would make the new one be up here. Then by the time we're exiting that, the new threshold will have approached the real one. And I'll draw lines for where the waveform would have gone. And then since we're scaling everything down, our new positions are going to be like here. So it will have executed a curve that doesn't have that edge in it. Like I'm trying to avoid this shape, where it's hitting the threshold point and then harshly changing it. So if it does this 80 clip styly thing, or the one corner clip is perfect for this, because if it's a compressor, that means that it doesn't have to be worrying about the exit. Like it's going to be turning down the level, so it's not going to be exiting from a clipping stage. It never reached the clipping stage in the first place. And it's not quite the slew deciding where the threshold will be. It's a question of whether or not your sample coming in exceeded that threshold and where it's going to put its new target. This would be fun if it turns out that it's like the most ultimate limiter ever and people watched it being made. That'd be kind of cool. We'll see. One can hope. I'll see whether I can do a good job of it. But the idea of avoiding aliasing in a compressor with a really fast attack is kind of like this. Kind of like it's watching for those points where it's exceeding the threshold and then more slowly applying the onset. But the end result becomes still a attenuation that is, you know, compression limiting. It's attenuating it to be within this range. And you could have that be bipolar, kind of like the butter comp, meaning that you have two separate ones. One is positive, one is negative. And you could squish the positive and not touch the negative if it turned out that that was needful. That would probably also be useful for a limiter type behavior. Although it might... It would throw a bunch of odd-numbered harmonics and even-numbered harmonics, and possibly create a crossover issue. But then that's kind of the same deal with butter comp. You could do this with butter comp just to make it be able to handle stuff faster, because butter comp is very slow to react. Butter comp doesn't even begin to cut stuff off as soon as it hits the iron bar. It'll overshoot quite severely and slowly dial stuff back in. That makes it a good test bed for this, because that already has the it's already interleaved, and it already has the behavior I want. I should make a drawing for interleaved, since I'm making all these drawings. So if I've got a bunch of samples and I'm doing a interleaved one, well, the thing about doing the thresholds the way that I'm talking about is I don't need to consider two thresholds, because it'll just make up the other one on the fly as it goes. That's what one corner clip does, is it's like it's making up a clip on the fly, but every single time it exceeds, and I don't remember whether I've got it going between previous thresholds, but I know that it's going between previous samples and how much it's clipping. I think it's converging on the real clip level. So if we've got the two thresholds you're talking about, it does mollify and give room for a smoother behavior, but it's making up these new thresholds on the fly everywhere you go. Like here's an interesting example. Let's take a Dirac impulse. Suppose you've got this. Here's some samples, and there's one that's completely out of line. If you're clipping this using one corner clip or 80 clip, it will look at this. It'll go, it needs to be within this range, but guess what? Our previous one was way down here, so what we're going to do is split the difference. It'll split the difference, put it like here, and then the next one is already not clipped again. So it stops doing anything past that point. Rather than having the clip way up here, it'll take that single impulse and it'll dial it way back, and then it won't do anything further. So the resulting waveform becomes a lot mellower and very much clear of the clipping point, because our sample is not even close to the true clipping point. Let's see now. So interleaved. Here's the thing. The horizontal and vertical things are alternating. It's like across, up, across, up, across, up, across, up. If I do two separate compressors and have one only follow these guys, and one only follow these guys, you'll see that I have two different compressors and they're following different paths. They're getting different samples. And then if I've got again, -1, minus plus for each one, I've got an even more striking behavior, because what we've got is this is the shape of the minus samples, and this is the shape of the plus samples. Interleaved compressors that are doing every other sample like this get to react in such a way where if you get these Dirac impulses, if you get these single impulses that are way out of line, it can address those without actually touching the other compressor bank. And as a result, if you had that, like suppressing it to here, say, you'd have a waveform that suppressed the one set of impulses and the other ones aren't touched. So it's the other bit is more accurate because it's not getting compressed, and then the set that are the sort of odd-numbered impulses are the ones that are going over the threshold and getting turned down. And yes, I've also done this in threes rather than twos. That is purist squish. In fact, purist squish is like capacitor, but for compressors. This stuff does get complicated, but that's how I get the results that I do. I mean, you got to try some of these things sometimes. So, if you did a Buttercomp style thing that used this one corner clip for its thresholds, what you'd get is something where waveforms that blow past the threshold thing get recalculated so that the resulting yeah. I have used residue sequences for things like this before, yes. Primes are very interesting for all this kind of stuff. I've used primes in things like iron oxide and yeah, my question is, can I do an infinite speed attack like a limiter on this modified butter comp? Hopefully I'll be able to keep track of these ideas. So, when taking this kind of stuff, let's see now. I'm going to have to make some of these notes in English, otherwise I won't understand any of this stuff. So when I'm doing the threshold that acts like one corner clip and sets new thresholds at this level, I also have to set the gain. So that the amplitude of the new position for the sample is at the newly set thing, but then when you go to the next sample, rather than referring to that, I'm still referring to the threshold point. So basically, if all of my pieces of paper are getting filled with notes, 42 isn't a prime. Haha. Fooled you. And well, energy is one case of an algorithm where I'm using larger and larger things. However, if you're doing a compressor and it starts getting to that large of an expanse, like only every 200 samples does it come around again, that's not going to be an effective compressor at all. It's just going to turn it into noise. It'll just be kind of a grunge. Let's see now. So samples. If the samples are low like here, and then all of a sudden there's a bunch of them that are really high, and our threshold is nowhere near that point. Our threshold is down here. What we get is approaching this amount. So we go from here to our, let's say, 0.5. And we set gain to where gain places the whole wave at this scale, which is what compression does. What we've done is we have compressed it even harder than we would have. Like if we were compressing it literally to this with infinite attack speed, then it would end up there. However, if we compress everything to this, then place it there, and then our next waveforms become like see how I'm doing kind of the same shape as these ones up here? That's because everything got turned back down. But since we have a very fast release time because it's a limiter, they start being amplified again immediately. So this, they like twice the gain that they would otherwise be. So that would go to there, that would go to there. Every sample, they get louder and louder, and they're trying to amplify back up to where they were. Incredibly fast release time, too. since this one goes to here, I got a waveform where it softens that down. And then since this is past that original threshold again, we do that thing again, where again, we're dividing it. And this is our original set of samples, so we're looking at a sort of release like this. And like this, so that's the new position. And then this gets amplified again. We've just turned a thing where instead of going to a waveform with some pointy detail and high frequency stuff up here, the way this compressor interacted with the difference between the threshold and the one corner clip behavior smoothed out those differences and softened the front end of the waveform as well as smoothing it out enormously. I think there's potential here. The variation between very nice. Okay. So we're putting this stuff over there because I'm going to be referring to it because I'm going to be doing something with it. I'm not sure exactly how soon because I've got a backload of other plugins to do also, but that'll happen. That makes up for this mess where I did a bunch of work on the Axolotl and programmed it so that the clock outputs that it can do alternate between kick and bass. I've got like a 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 kind of thing for psytrance. And I coded that up and I made it do what I wanted, and I made a control voltage where it can change the pitch of the Mother 32, and I did all of those things, and I did not save my work, and I just uploaded it to the Flash and quit. So that's now got like state of the art for this morning synthesizer control stuff, and I have to do it all over again in order to be able to do anything at all with it. And of course, since it wasn't perfect, I still have more to do with it. So I've got a bunch of work to catch up for. But this thing with the limiter idea is softening the blow of that more than a little bit. So cool. It'll be quite interesting if I can incorporate that and maybe do a couple of different plugins, like a regular one and then the Buttercomp style one, and do a really fast limiter that sounds unlike anybody else's really fast limiter. That'd be very cool because I have not had a limiter. And the things people complain about with limiting and stuff like that is mostly that they're getting intersample peaks, and that behavior is exactly what you need in order to avoid intersample peaks. I don't think I did update tape delay. I think I did something else. Now I'm puzzled. I'm scrolling up to the top of my screen. See you later, Octopus on Fire. Let me remind myself again, tape delay. Do you mean when I do a reissue of something that existed once but has never existed as VST? Is that what you mean? What the hey? Ah, okay. Gamma has done something, but I'm not sure what it is. It's one of those things that YouTube lets you do. Fair enough. Cool beans. I can probably shut it off in my channel if I want. Uh, when did I update tape delay? Do you mean updated from back when it existed a long time, or Dither Me Timbers maybe is the one you're thinking of? See, Dither Me Timbers. Yeah. You're thinking of Dither Me Timbers. I put out Dither Me Timbers, and people went, oh no, this is causing my limiter to suddenly give overs. Oh, tempora, oh mores, how terrible. And so I had to put out a update. Yeah, bags of rice from the food discount. That'll be awesome. More likely to be true. Bernard, I'm convinced you're talking about Dither Me Timbers, because that came out, and then I had to put out an update, and the news about the update only existed on the forum posts that I was getting the complaints in. Although I did post to both, and I will tend to do this. Generally, I post to Gearsluts and I post to KVR when I put out a plugin, because those are the places that have a new product alert thing that's accessible to manufacturers and people like me, as long as you behave yourself and you do things properly. And I've learned how to do that, so yeah. So what happens is I will have that happening in the conversation of that thread. I'm going to go and look, and I'm pretty sure that yeah, the Dither Me Timbers post on Air Windows is not altered, because the Dither Me Timbers post on Air Windows doesn't say anything about having massive overs. It's putting itself forth as if it is doing a thing in a particular way. And as a result, I kind of didn't talk further about it on Air Windows. All I did was update the file in place. So if you go to Air Windows, you get the new version. And I've updated what's in new updates.zip as well. And I updated the GitHub, so the open source says all of that stuff got updated, but the announcement of that something changed was happening on the forums where people were complaining about problems. So now what I'm wondering is, do you need new posts on the Air Windows website for something like that? Because it could become like succession of posts, including little follow-ups. And that is something that I could do. It hadn't occurred to me to do it. Or do you feel as if I had done the updates and then on the forums where people were complaining about problems, there wasn't a information about it? Because I'll tell you one thing I'm not going to be able to do. I could put another post up on Air Windows. I cannot make a new product release post for a bug fix. Neither of these places would let me do that. They would consider it spammy and people would start having big problems. So what does the yes mean? Does the yes mean you want me to do a follow-up post on Air Windows and not on the forums? Is it particularly important to have a specific follow-up post on the forums, or should it just include mention of the succession of versions or whatever is being done in the post in question? Because if I'm not mistaken, does it need to be a separate post? I'm going to dial back here a little bit. And console 5. when I go to look at the console 5 thing, I have a update to the console 5 post, which was around Christmas of last year. I've got a part that says, note, the original version used a different sort of slew handling that freaked out in waves like sawtooths. It had to be rehacked. If you'd like a copy of the first fix, which is like the launched version but slightly moderated, because I kept updating it, so I updated the post, but there wasn't really a succession of additional posts on Air Windows. Instead, it's an update of the here, I'll link that. But Crystal could be used in individual tracks and also on the master bus. You don't have to. If you really love it, you can just put it all over everything and get more and more of it. Now, there, Air Windows COM Console 5. This is one where I've updated the post rather than making an additional post after it. How does that work as far as the updates and things are concerned? Because this is another one of those update in places, and the trouble with that is that especially the first fix that I had, I have a whole pile of, it was a pile of hell that year. That was not fun. My mom had just died, and I wanted to put out this wonderful thing for everybody, and I did not account for the fact that it freaked out when given sawtooth waves, which are very common for some virtual synthesizers. Entire synthesizer tones could exist that would cause the original console to flip the hell out. So that was not a fun holiday season. This holiday season has been better than that, in at least some certain ways. What does Max for Live do? Have you got an example that I can look at as far as what they did regarding some kind of update? Because that's the way that I work often, is if I'm doing something and I can see an example that I can mimic or copy in terms of behavior, I can usually do that. It's a pity about all this stuff. It would have been much nicer if it would have been much more convenient if I just left things alone, and then a bunch of people would find it totally unusable and it would have come out as totally broken. Let's see. I have a link that I can look at. Well, that was weird. Let's see whether I can make this work. Might take me a bit. I got to retype the whole thing because the link in chat there, if I directly clicked it, I think it would just give me a whole other window, and I wasn't looking for that. So instead, I need to retype this a bit. There we go. Alrighty, so I'm on that site now, and where's a good place to find the update behavior that you're telling me about? You got newest downloads, device categories, of which there are many, newest devices and updated devices. Here, I wonder if I can go to that as a, nope, it's just a stack of things. Multiband Center has had 2 updates in a quick succession. Okay, so that's like a post. Are they replacing existing versions or simply throwing different ones? Because sometimes if I have stuff that seems to be a damagingly bad bug that got by me somehow, I'll be live updating in place, and so the previous post won't really have any significance. But I do believe I see what you're talking about here, because you've got 2 separate categories. Here, let me take a moment to answer that before I talk about Jolie's question. I'm just going to note that down. So what you've got there, and the updated devices are actually, so if you go to multiband center, what you get in newest devices, if you go to multiband center, what you get is the most recent version. That's cool. But then updated devices is a set of other things. So yeah. So newest devices would be the most recent version, and updated devices contains each point chronologically. I'm not necessarily going to be able to do that because I'm running on WordPress, and it's this may or may not be something like that. Honestly, that could be a kind of WordPress that I'm looking at. But the updated devices are things where something is recently changed. I'll come up with a way of making something like that work. Like I can make a category for contains a tag. Which I don't really use tags, so that would work. So that might be helpful. So we'll toss that over into the pile of things to do. I might be able to do something like that, Bernard. And if I can make it work, I thank you for prompting me to do it, because it seems as if that would be helpful. It seems as if there would be a positive thing about that. It would be on the timeline and fall into the category of most recently updated. I bet that's doable. I bet it is doable. Cool. So, Jolie, that is a very reasonable thing to do, to be concerned about plugins adding a volume bump. One of the reasons that I went all Patreon and open source and stuff like that is to just start defining a way of doing business that I'm not following what you're saying, Bernard, but over to Jolie again. I started doing that because a bunch of competing plugins in the commercial sphere were doing really obvious volume boosts, and they do that so that inexperienced people click on, turn the plugin on, and go, oh my god, it's so much better. And yeah, this is not great. So Julian meter is probably good. That would work pretty well. Loudness units is going to be relevant. People have been bugging me to always include output gain and stuff, and sometimes I listen better than other times. There are certain things where the effect that it causes is always making stuff smaller or less, and those I don't often feel that I need to make an output level to put back what was taken away. So like something like average or whatever is taking away highs, and I don't usually feel that I need to stick an output level on something like that. I think partly just remaining aware that that is something that happens will serve you. That what you can do is just know not to be fooled. Know that any given plugin that you turn on, it could be doing a volume bump, and depending upon what kind of thing it is. And I think that's something that's, I think I might have tripped over that with Dither Me Timbers, because the noise shaping ended up putting additional peaks in. So I'm not sure where that stands. Yeah. I will try to be better about involving it. It runs into my desire to make plugins that have just one slider or one or two sliders. Having to always stick in like 4 or 5 sliders and all this other stuff. And then also there's the output gain, and then also there's the dry wet. This, when like Reaper lets you do dry wet and literally everything. And yet it is a valid concern. It is a valid thing to want. So, yeah. Anyways, I have no business being too fussy over interface stuff, because my choices around interface are so iconoclastic anyhow that, people are not normally going to be like, oh, wow, I love the beautiful, simple interface. They'll be like, oh, that's really ugly, but it sounds good, so we're going to use it anyway. Also, it's free. So, Bernard, you're losing me with the structure of plugin folders. I don't understand what you mean by that. And the reason I don't understand what you mean is that audio units cannot have a structure of plugin folders, because they can't be in individual folders. And I don't know whether VSTs can or not, but I know that they are all restricted by, you have to have only one at a time of a particular kind. They will all have, like, say, well, say I made a plugin called Ditherbird. See, I got that. Both the audio unit and the VST are going to be looking at air windows, and I forget what my code name under audio unit is, but I have a code name for air windows under audio unit. And both will have a bit of information like this tucked into in the audio unit. That is a separate file that has your identifier name, and then you've also got that tucked in there. And then in the VST, in the beginning of the .h file, you've got a place where this goes. And this is how it can tell plugins apart when they go into the VST or the components folder, is it's looking for this information, and that's how it distinguishes one from another. So if you ever have a situation where you make a plugin and you've made lots of plugins, but you've used the same one for 2 different plugins, it's only going to show one of them at a time. And I've had that happen to me before. So it's the code. You don't actually get to see the code. It's internal to the software, but the code is what says which plugin is which. That means if I have 2 different versions of this one, they have to have different codes, or you have to have only one of them in the folder at the same time. If you have like a version 1 and then a version 2 or a bug fix, and they're both using the same one, that means 2 things. One, you got version 1. It has bugs and problems, but you made some stuff using it. You take version 2, which has the bug fix, but you wanted to remember the settings that you put on version 1 for Ditherbird. You just wanted to have the problems fixed and not lose all of your settings. You drop the new version in, it has the same controls, and it has the same number, And the DAW will go and take the old settings from your old version and plug it onto the new version without changing anything. That's why we use the same setting. Back when I was doing demos for the audio units, I had to make the demos have the same settings so that the real version would honor this what you did with the demo rather than resetting it all to 0 again. The other issue is that if you are, so I'm going to ask, are you using VST? Because what I'm seeing here is that it is possible to manually organize folders on your hard disk into subfolders if they are VSTs. If they are audio units, you cannot do that. So I'm assuming you got to be using VSTs here. Are you talking about doing it inside the DAW only, rather than on the computer, like in Finder or Windows Explorer or whatever it is that you're using? Because the thing is, you cannot do that with audio units. You'll not see them. Audio units are only organized by the manufacturer and then alphabetically in the list. So VSTs, yes. I don't know whether if you organize them in subfolders in the VST folder, it'll also place them into subfolders in the menus. Because those aren't the kind that I use. I'm making them to be available and to make them so that people stop having problems with them and they still work. But I don't sort mine into subfolders. Okay. So Windows VSTs then. Oh, interestingly, somebody says on VST on the Mac, when they enable VSTs, they get a horrible list of all the developers being lumped together, which seems bad. I'm seeing that also, so. Also, in the one thread that I'm reading about this, somebody who with a banned account was like, oh, that's a terrible idea, I never do that. Okay, let me wade my way through this again. Copy link. Undo the whole pile of mess that it causes. I'm having to retype all of the stuff in order to see any of the things that you say. But fortunately, I know what these things are. Okay. Seems cool. You can't do that on audio unit. You can only do that on VST. I assume you can do that with Mac VSTs. I haven't tried it. My concern here is I'm not sure if, like, we'll go back to my example of Ditherbird. It doesn't exist, but I'll go back to that anyways. I'm not sure that if you have a Ditherbird version 1.01 and it's DTBD, and then you have Ditherbird 1.02, and my stuff doesn't usually fiddle with the version numbers a lot. In fact, I'm not sure how much the VST has all that. And that's in an entirely different subfolder, but it has the same ID. I'm not sure whether you'll get the different ones from your folder organization. It could be different for different VST hosts as well. That's the thing. Organizing. There's somebody on KVR saying they can't Ditherborg. Yeah, that'd be good. DTBG. Somebody on KVR is like, I can't organize my VST folder. They should be talking to you, Bernard, because apparently you can. Load all your plugins into a project, save the project bones, and organize the FST files into folders. Okay. This must be somebody's... oh, it's a Fruity Loop Studio thing. See, it's going to be different for different hosts. Different hosts will have different behaviors. Here's another person talking about organizing VSTs on Windows. Shortcuts and subfolders. Yeah, a lot of this stuff is basically just operating system or DAW style stuff. Now let me scroll up a little bit and see what your context was with this. So remember, you got into that, and I forget what you were asking from me, other than this would be good. You're talking about handling updates. So that's a relevant observation. And structure of plugin folders. Well, I mean, that seems legit, yeah. Generally, rather than giving versions of things version numbers, I just start renaming them. Like successive plugins and successive plugin designs might be channel 2, channel 3, channel 4, and so on, rather than channel 1.04 or 1.05. And I do everything possible to make sure that I never have to release an update of any kind. So I'm not in the habit of doing like, this is the 1.07.2 release. It doesn't really work like that with their Windows. They're very simple, small plugins, and they're either going to work or they're going to be totally broken. And if they're totally broken, they need to be replaced rather than just updated. So I grant, however, that it is tricky. It is definitely kind of tricky because it gets into things like Console 5, where Console 5, the broken one, had the magic tone, and the fixes didn't necessarily have the same magic tone, and that was a problem. So, I work with that stuff as well as I can. It's not by any means perfect, and if I can improve on stuff like that, then I will. Kind of like with the putting in a updated tag so that I can have another little section of the most recently updated things. I can populate that actually by going through and finding the stuff that got updates, and then they can live in that category. I mean, some of them will be from a year ago or whatever, but whatever. that would be compliant to the concern. That would be one way of fixing it. Okay, I got about 20 minutes to go if I'm doing another 2 hours. I suppose I don't have to do 2 hours necessarily. I think when I started out, I thought maybe it was going to be an hour long, and then it's been 2 or 2.5 hours. So, I don't know. You tell me. Have we got more questions? I'm here to answer them. I'm all out of coffee, but by the same token, I have drunk all my coffee. Well, actually, not quite. There's a little more. There, now I'm all out of coffee. Unless I make more, I could do that. So this is the sketchy little... well, I'm not sure how sketchy it can be if I came out of it with the new limiter design. That would be nice. I'm looking forward to fooling with that. I'm not sure how soon it will be, but there's some stuff that I can do. Ah, Mike England. What you got? EQ. What would you like to have me answer about EQ? Jolie, what do I think of running crystal into bus colors? I wouldn't do it, but I don't use either of those plugins, so don't go by me. The bottom line is you're allowed to run anything into anything. If you like the way it sounds, that's the important thing. It's possible and legitimate to use synthesizers in such a way that they're changing stuff around radically. Things don't have to follow rules of, bus colors must only work in a certain way to make the desired sound. It's like, no, you can run 20 of them into each other to make a big exaggerated sound. So Mike, what's your question about EQ? I will definitely stick around to answer it. I mean, the asking questions like, what would I do about this or that or thus and so, does tend to bring things onto that level of what my personal tastes are. And people don't have to respect my personal tastes on things, but I can still express them. I could still say, like, well, I wouldn't run crystal into bus colors because it's more color adding and stuff, and there's no reason that I would do that with anything. Oh, you're praising. Cool, thank you. Thank you so much. What a nice way to end the year. Is somebody being like, what a good EQ. That I'm glad you like it, and I might be able to top it, depending upon what kind of sound you were looking for. Like the reason the EQ works the way that it does, a separate question with that, the capacitor. EQ works kind of like this. I get another piece of paper because I'm going to need it. Let's say this time this is just a frequency response. And you can filter stuff. Like say the top frequency is here. If you do a simple average filter, you can take that away, or an IIR filter, just continually sort of converging on a single waveform, and any given point is like 1/10 of the new sample and then 9/10 of all the previous samples. And that'll make an IIR filter that will roll off high frequencies. If you subtract that, you can make the opposite of it, where only the high frequencies are left. If you add these together, you get the original waveform out again. Then if you do one at a much lower frequency, it can roll off like way down here. If you subtract that, you can get the opposite again. And stuff like density and drive include a high-pass filter, much like this. And if you had, say, this section here that's just high is up to here. And then you subtracted the top roll off. What you would have is a band in bold like that. And that can become, this is like part of the insides of EQ, is you have these bands that are built up out of just subtractions of simpler forms of things. And if you add them all together at unity gain, you get exactly the output again. Now, then if you attenuate this, what you wind up with is an overall frequency response that might be kind of like this, because you took this part of the equation, this internal buffer, this like, I'm saving all the bassy stuff here, and then I'm taking the remainder of that, and I'm subtracting the high frequency stuff there. And if you subtract this one in the middle so it's not as loud as the other stuff that adds up to unity, you wind up with a dip. And the neat thing about it is that if you use only a tiny amount of dip there, it gets very, very close to literally the same, signal coming in. In other words, the way EQ calculates its things with this sort of additive subtractive thing means that it adds up to exactly what you put in. And if you make small variations of anything, the small variations of anything result in very little degradation of the sound. Now, air and energy are very different. Air and energy are kind of like, we'll call that 0 or something. Air and energy are waveforms that look kind of like that. You start cranking it up, and you get this one big spike, and then you've also got some other weird artifacts happening around here. And that's happening because they're kind of like little circles of buffer spinning around very fast. And when a signal comes in and you say you add some to one sample, then the next sample might not have that change. It's the way air and energy work are doing this strange thing that's kind of like one of the dither noise shaping behaviors, but it's doing it at a bunch of different rates. It'll do it at like 2, 3, or 4, or 5, or so on sample buffers. So they're almost not like equalizers at all. Instead, they're like energy throwers. They produce these funny artifacts that are related to high frequencies. So they can latch onto stuff and exaggerate them in an interesting way without pre-ring and with a very strange and overbearing frequency response, which is kind of weird and like this. And they overlap. So if you had energy and you had a bunch of things like that, the energy bands don't actually work with each other. They kind of clash in a weird way. So you get very unusual behaviors out of energy and air because it's not a normal EQ behavior. Whereas again, EQ is very normal EQ behaviors, and it's doing it in a way that is just smoother. Also, the high band on EQ includes the air when you boost, only when you boost. So, yeah, I'm glad that you like them. They are definitely kind of unusual. I have hopes of adding a more of what they call a biquad filter kind of thing, because it turns out I'll grab another piece of paper. So those can be like samples. If you are mixing stuff, if these were tracks, channels, then you could mix them using console, and they would combine to a end result. And using console, you get to avoid the digital mix bus issues. Now, one of the interesting things about a filter is that there is kind of filter where you've got a, say, maybe a sample latency so that you're including adjacent samples and combining them at different parameters, like 0, 7, 5, and 2, and you can also take the one that you've just done and include it some of that in your new calculation. That's what a biquad is. It's like a sort of IIR filter, but it's also incorporating, I guess that having only one side of it would make it a quad. But a biquad means you're doing a combination of the new samples coming in and the history of all the previous samples you've had. I can't explain it right now. I have been able to work out basically how it works, but I can't explain it on paper. I can't explain it right now. It's been about 2 hours. I'm getting a little burnt. But the point is, doing a biquad filter involves like this IIR behavior, and it involves storing previous samples and combining them with the existing samples. That makes it fair game for using the console algorithm. And people don't normally do this because they are like, why would you do that? Math is perfect. There's no problem. But this is one of the things that can happen also with, say, here. Try this sometime. Yeah, take console channel, put it in front of like your generic DAW EQ, like Logic Channel EQ, whatever Reaper's got, anything like that, which is just biquad filters, and it's just what comes with the machine. Then put channel bus after it. And what you'll have is a normal type EQ that has been subjected to the console, the console project. The combination between small delays and things make it subject to what console does. And you can do that with Purist Console, the simplest form, which doesn't have any weird artifacts or anything like that. Or any other version. You could do Purist Drive Console, you could do Atmosphere. But you can put those around a generic digital EQ and get a different behavior out of it, because it's not just doing something on samples at one time position. It's generating samples at slight delays and combining them. And because it's generating stuff on slight delays, that means the console stuff can apply to it. I'll be getting more into that as I develop actual plugins of that nature. Suffice to say, this is something that you can do. Console channel, EQ, and then console bus will cause things to happen. In particular, the EQ that you're using will become more responsive as if it was like an analog EQ. Boosts will get you more mojo out of whatever the boost is. You know, it will just act more like real-world, non-digital EQs. Okay, so yeah, I'm flagging fast. Does anybody have any more questions for the last 4 minutes before I head out? Probably make myself another cup of coffee, read a cough drop or something. Oh, we might be winding up. Absolutely. Try that combination. And you know, one of the interesting things about it is, like back in console 4, where I had it set up so that it worked with bus colors and stuff, which is not to say that you can't use weird combinations of misapplied. When I recommend one kind over another, it's because I made them cancel out perfectly. So purist console channel and purist console bus will cancel out perfectly. On the other hand, if you took like bus colors for and console 4 bus, you know, those ones were set up so that they would combine with each other and cancel out pretty darn well. You take the bus colors for, and I'm going to look it up now in hopes that I can identify the settings I'm thinking of. May or may not be able to. Yeah, it doesn't talk about any of them. There's a setting in bus colors for that's taken from a Manly Massive Passive. I don't use that plugin, so I don't remember what it's called. One of the lower ones rather than one of the top ones. If you use that into a channel EQ into like console 4 bus, I think Luxor. I think it's Luxor. Here, I'll type it into chat. Boop. So if you use that on bus colors 4 into an EQ into console 4 bus, you get a sort of faux Manly Massive Passive because that's the impulse. The impulse for that setting on bus colors is based off of that hardware, and you combine it with an EQ, and that's one of the sort of brighter, sparklier variations in bus colors. What you get is a kind of slick, glossy, fancy sounding EQ. And that's fun to try with. That's neat to play with. It's really nice for things like treble glitter and stuff. Adding a little sparkle to things, it'll come out a lot better that way. Now, when I come up with an algorithm, how long does it usually take until I make a video on it? That really kind of depends. I have to build the whole plugin. It could be a week. It could be a couple months. Depends upon what else I have in the queue, what else I'm busy doing. Because I've made promises about stuff that I'm going to release, and I try to keep to that. Sometimes if I have a really hot idea, I play around with it and it starts to work really well, that'll bump it up in the schedule. So that's not really something I feel I can predict. It'll kind of stuff like that happens when it happens. Which is to say, I don't know exactly when you're going to get the peak limiter I was talking about this time. But I have an angle on doing one, so that is, there will be that. And that said, I believe I have got to the 1 p.m. mark and gone for 2 hours. Seeing as I'm still kind of recovering, I'm going to call it a day. Oh, I've got one more question. I'm not going to be shutting people down when they're asking questions, so you can keep me by throwing more questions at me if you need to. Am I happy with the Patreon right now? Reasonably. It's doing fine. It's not quite as good as it was last month. I lost some subscribers and stuff. I don't think that is because of people getting upset with deplatforming, although that's always a possibility, I suppose. I wish they wouldn't do that on my back. I didn't do anything to make them mad. But it's still basically fine. It hasn't grown month over month this last month, but usually it does. So, and yeah, as far as Patreon behavior and what how they're treating me perfectly fine. I have no cause to complain as far as how that's working out. They're not doing anything bad to me. If people want them never to be doing anything bad to anybody, then I guess that depends upon who you like and what you consider bad. But I can confirm that they're not doing anything bad to me. So, go figure. And I come to them from previously having used Kagi shareware. So, I do consider them to be kind of a payment collector and stuff. And they save me a lot of burden as far as things are concerned. And they're really quite good at that. They're as good as anything else like that I've seen. They have very competitive rates, and they put up, they make their little website available for things and stuff. It is, I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with Patreon. I would like it to continue growing, but as far as Patreon's behavior itself with regard to me, I have no reason to be unhappy with them. They have been fine. They have been good to me. So far, so good. Anyways, I will talk to you guys later. And I'll see if I can't get some of those plugin ideas rolling. Bye-bye.